I'm Steve Swain, and I'm the director of the Montgomery Fellows Program. In our conversations with Phil Klay, we paired him up with former Marines, but here's a different kind of conversation. Someone who's not a Marine, someone who is not a veteran, someone who is not a man. And yet the conversation between Roberta Stewart, a professor of classics at Dartmouth College, and Phil is elucidating, moving, informative, and inspiring. I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed it.
I am so glad to speak with you today. And so thank you. And I really look at this opportunity to speak together because Dartmouth does need to hear you and needs to hear what you have to say to us. So I'd like to start with your time at Dartmouth, because many of the War Story students are looking forward to seeing you. Many Dartmouth students are curious to hear your experience. You were an English creative writing major, then a Marine, and now a writer who writes a lot about, maybe exclusively about military matters. When did you know you were going to become a writer, and what did you imagine yourself writing before you were a Marine at Dartmouth and a creative writer?
Well, first off, I'd just like to say that it's fantastic to see you. I wish I was there in person, but it's wonderful to see you via Zoom. It's always been a pleasure seeing you up at Dartmouth, and your War Stories class has always been. Uh, the last time I went and visited your class, it was a rough and tumble, but very very good discussion, and that is exactly what I think any writer would want. And I'm really looking forward to seeing your class here as well. As far as becoming a writer, I think the as far as being a big reader, that particular disease strikes early. I always loved books. My parents used to, after they told me to go to bed, they'd find me underneath the covers with a flashlight reading. I think the first time I had a story where I felt like I was really risking something on the page. It was my junior year. Christian Talbot was my English teacher at Regis High School, and we had to write a satire. And I decided that I was going to satirize modern dating, including some stuff that I was drawing from my own life, where I was somewhat mocking myself. And it mattered to me. I was really trying to write something really good. There's a thing I think sometimes you see in Dartmouth students where they sort of brag about the fact that they only spent an hour writing a paper and then got a fine grade, right? This wasn't one of those things where it's sort of like protected. Like I didn't try that hard, so even if I didn't get the greatest grade, nothing was really risked. Um, Here, it really mattered to me. So I wrote this thing, and it was profane and just totally inappropriate in every way, right? So about 2 weeks before the thing was due, I went to my English teacher and I said, "Look, I wrote this satire, but there's like profanity, there's some content, maybe not entirely appropriate. So if you could read it and just to see if it was acceptable to turn in. If not, I'll write something without that." That was my ruse, right? Uh, my excuse to have him look at the paper and see whether or not it was good. And the way that Regis had it set up, there was the English teachers all had their desks in one room, and there were desks where students could sit too. So you would hang out with fellow students and also the teachers around, which was great. So I handed it to him, and then I went to a desk at the back of the room where my friends were and started chatting with them. But of course, like the only thing that I was looking at was like looking at him reading my satire. And then he started laughing, and uh, eventually he finished it. He called me over, and he just said like, "This is fantastic," and he gave me a high honors. And I was hooked. Um, I should also note that I later took a short story class where I probably wrote the worst short story of anyone in that class. There's no problem with that. I wrote the worst short story of anybody in that class. So when you risk something, it doesn't always work. But that I think was an early early indication of like, this is something that I can do where I'm passionate about it, and where I really feel like something's on the line when I'm doing it. And so I think that that is the beginning. It was the way for me, in some ways, to expose myself the most, because when you're writing fiction, there's this veil. You're writing about other characters, and yet you imbue them with everything that is of utmost concern to you.
And so when you were writing, you wrote satire, and then you go off to the the war, or
Hmm.
you went into the Marines. And what drove you to write about those experiences? Did you? I'm trying to read my notes here. Is it personal?
Hmm.
Or is it another opportunity to serve? Are you trying to tell us
Yeah,
something when you're writing about the war?
it's a mix of all those things. You know, I studied at Dartmouth with Tom Slay, who's a wonderful poet, um, and also I took classes with Barbara Dimmick and Cynthia Huntington, and I think all of them had sort of different approaches to material that was could be deeply personal, right? But there was a degree of analytic rigor. And, Tom in particular has always stressed, sort of trying to, when you're trying to talk about issues that are politically weighted, right? You go to a war that's a topic of political discussion, and you come home and you feel like, Tom's phrase, you're in a hell of opinions, right?
Mhm.
And he always pushed for sort of writing that is uh, Dick Jones, the great British World War One poet, said, to be incarnational. Um, what does it feel like? What does it look like? What is the physical embodied experience? Um, and so, just trying to cut past that hell of opinions that sort of starts to confuse you about what you even experienced yourself, and try and cut to those very basic questions about what it's like, were important for me, trying to sort of make sense of what I was a part of. And not just necessarily personal experiences, but sort of trying to understand how I fit in this much larger thing that um, my country was engaged in. And so, on the one level, it was deeply personal, and on the other, it was, yeah, I think it was about a sense of service. I think that I have obligations to think about and write about, to communicate about the wars, not just because I served in them, but because I'm an American citizen. And I think that we all have those responsibilities. And so that is one of the things that drives me forward. I feel that that hasn't changed.
Mhm. You've written short stories, you've written
Yeah.
essays, you've tried different genres to communicate these ideas. Do you think, I have two questions here. One is, when you're using different genres, do they have different rhetorical functions? Are they
Mhm.
better for different truths?
Yeah.
And what are these truths that you have in Redeployment versus your New York Times essays?
It's always a dangerous thing trying to ask a writer what truths they were going after, because I think that sometimes the writer doesn't know themselves. I remember reading,
Socrates.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, reading like Richard Yates' explanation of one of his novels, and I was just thinking, that's not it. Um, Revolutionary Road. Um, but yes, they do have different functions. The short story is, it's its own sort of kind of self-contained little world, right? And though when I wrote Redeployment, I did write the short stories to talk to one another. They were ordered in a particular way. It was meant to be sort of one unified experience reading the book. Um, but each of those is, because of the nature of the form, it's much smaller. It's centered on, usually, on one character, uh, a few sort of um, powerful or important incidents that occur that that person is grappling with, the sort of relatively few choices that they make, and it follows sort of a relatively simple progression because that's all you have space for, right? Whereas with a novel, um, you know, one of the problems for communicating the nature of modern war is it is so unbelievably complicated. Um, it is sort of globalized, sort of different tactics and techniques from one war move to another. People move from one war to another. There's so many different sort of moving parts and so many different players, and also so many different kind of like um, states of consciousness and perspectives and ideological systems that you sort of project onto reality that are at play in modern war. So in a short story, you have a sort of limited number of just sort of perspectives that you can actually deal with. Um, and the novel allowed me much greater scope to talk about the broader system of how we do violence around the world, right? Which could only have been done in a much longer form. Um, and sort of nonfiction is norm, is there's different types of nonfiction. Sometimes I've used it to try and express very sort of personal um, memories and sort of as a means of grappling with. Um, I wrote an essay for the American Scholar about uh, the deaths of children overseas, and my chaplain who, um, when there were sort of injured children who there was nothing more to be done, would actually sort of hold them in his arms until they died. And trying to write about that directly and reflect on his experience versus mine. That was something that could only have been done in nonfiction in the way that I wanted it to. But but then there's sort of more directed rhetorical points, right? Like we when we killed Qasem Soleimani, you know, what does this mean for Iraq policy? How are we to think of this in relation to our broader military policy? That's an issue well suited for a for an essay.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot in war stories about what kind of truths you can have in a war story, and the capacity of fiction
Yeah.
um, to communicate truth, and perhaps less of a historical truth of dates and place and named agents, but perhaps a deeper truth. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, in some ways, the just sort of accepting that it's fiction allows people to go right to the core questions. It's interesting. I spoke with a chaplain. So one of my stories in redeployment is about a chaplain in a unit that has done war crimes, right? And he said that he uses that story for training because if you bring up real stories, right? He said everybody gets very quiet because the stakes suddenly feel very, very high to talk about real things that might happen overseas. But if you're talking about a story, well, then all of a sudden everybody opens up because it's sort of safer, right? It offers this opportunity for people um, to talk about these things that are deeply important that they might actually have some experience with, but under the guise that it is fiction, right? It also asks the reader to come in and imagine themselves in the place of the other person. And I think that people are much more willing to let their guard down and and think through experiences very alien to them. And that allows you to get at, because you're not concerned with the did this actually happen, um, you go straight to moral, psychological, philosophical, and spiritual truths, right? That are being communicated through very specific people in very specific places, made as real and vivid as they possibly can be made. Um, and so, yeah, I think that fiction is, for me, it is the most rigorous way to get at truth. I write nonfiction as well, but when I'm grappling with something that is truly difficult, um, I think that the surest way to try and explore that, and to try and sort of push myself further in my understanding of something, is to write fiction about it, because the fiction is inevitably so messy. When you're writing nonfiction, it's much easier to make a clean argument, and fiction doesn't behave that way, or at least it shouldn't, right? If it's good fiction.
Um, so I have this is a follow up on this, and you know that I both teach war stories at Dartmouth, and I run reading groups with veterans, both locally here and now in Massachusetts, and they're elsewhere. And I actually sent around an email to some of the veterans of the veteran reading group and asked them if they had questions they'd want to pose you. And one of them touches right on this. And um, one member asked, how much and where is your own experience portrayed in redeployment? There's these deeper truths, yes, but also is Phil Clay's experience in redeployment?
How many dogs did I shoot? That's what. No, I have not killed any dogs. Um, the It's hard to say, because so there's certainly things that happened in my real life that I put into the fiction. The weird thing about how fiction works, though, is that sometimes when you're drawing on something that really happened to you, when you put it in fiction, it doesn't feel that close to you. But then you'll write about something that is totally foreign to anything that ever happened in your life, and somehow it'll feel like that experience um, is actually really central. And sometimes sometimes other people will see what you were writing about before you were. Um, uh, there was something very painful that had been happening with an extended family member, and years after a redeployment came out, a friend said, "Oh, when you were writing this story, was it actually about that?" And I sort of thought to myself, like, "Oh, oh yeah, it was." But I had no idea that it was working itself out in the fiction that was happening at a level that I was not at all conscious of. Um, so uh, yeah, there's things that happen in real life. Um, I was asked to try and teach Iraqi children baseball, because it would it would instill all the lessons for democracy that would um, uh, you know make this project a success. There are lots of different little anecdotes and things that happened, or things that are close to things that happened. Um, you know, uh, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the most personal things.
There it is. Uh, so who are you writing for? And I mean that both in the sense of technically when you're writing,
Hmm.
who's your interlocutor?
Hmm.
But I also mean, who do you want to read these books? Who's gonna read this and say, I learned something really important. So both
I,
questions, please.
I'm writing for Professor Roberta Stewart at Dartmouth College in the classics department. Um,
Who needs to
no,
hear what you say?
but actually, that's not entirely a joke. That I'm not writing for. I'm not writing exclusively for military audience. I have them in mind. I wrote, redeployment with like an imaginary long line of veterans out the door waiting to kick my ass if I screwed things up. Um, but it was very important to me that the book be something that a civilian reader who cared about these topics, was interested in them, was willing to engage, was willing to open themselves up to these depictions of experiences that could be fairly rough. Um, that it would be something that they could use, not just sort of read and enjoy, but use as something that could help them think through the wars that we're engaged in, the veterans in our communities, what it means to be an American, right? In the present age.
Right, right. There's a lot of contention on who can actually tell these stories of war. And I think that one of the things I talk about with the students a lot is that that's a very old contention.
Yes.
You can actually see it in Homer when Odysseus says to the poet, tell me about the sack of Troy, because and he sets him up to tell it wrong by giving a wrong detail. And you can see it in modern day comments of you weren't there, how can you comment, to oftentimes to civilians. But I'm thinking about, again, my questions always have multiple parts, so I'll start with the first part. What value do you see in journalistic accounts of war? For
Hmm.
example, Jake Tapper's Outpost, another Dartmouth
Sure.
alum.
Yeah.
Can he offer an insight that perhaps soldiers who are in the weeds perhaps can't recognize? Do you see that value there? Do you see value there?
Absolutely. I mean, a tremendous value. And uh, it's interesting. There's you mentioned Jake Tapper. There's a uh, soldier I know, Stony Portis, who was at the Battle of Cop Keating, had a very good piece in the New York Times about having this battle that he was a part of being transformed into a movie, and why that was a good experience. That it is deeply important that these stories be told, and also, like, you know you think you're gonna get the truth if only veterans are telling the story. Like, there are things that we don't want everybody to know.
Yeah.
Right? We're as self-interested as any other group in American society, right? We need people from the outside, um, telling stories. I mean, sometimes even just for our own good, right? I mean, do you think the sort of outrageous problems that there were in healthcare for injured soldiers would have um, been fixed had there not been the degree of sort of journalistic exposés of what was going on?
Mhm.
Uh, it actually, it really drives me nuts when um, people act as though, sort of within the military, as a journalists are sort of the enemy, the enemies of the people, because it's tremendously, tremendously important. We're a democracy. If anything, we have too little coverage of these wars. If anything, we have sort of too little access, right? I mean, one of the things that is disturbing to me about the ways that the wars are waged now is that they're done with sort of specialized units, and often with sort of drone strikes or special operations troops. And there's very little sort of access for journalists in terms of figuring out how we as a country are killing people overseas. And that's, I think, a really morally fraught proposition. So, um, that there's any number of ways that you know it can be tremendously important to have somebody from the outside looking in, um, talking about things, and also just like on a basic level, right? It can be helpful to have somebody who's not inside an experience talk to you about it or reflect it back at you, because you they might be able to pick up on truths that you don't have access to because you're inside it, right? And we are all used to this in terms of like relationships, right? So you go to your wise friend and you're like, oh, my girlfriend or boyfriend did XYZ, and your wise friend listens to you and they're like, actually, you're the one being an asshole, right? Like, this is not an uncommon thing, or like crazy to people, that somebody who's not directly invested in that experience might have some wisdom to share when they hear about it, right? But we pretend that's not the case with war. And look, certainly,
Yeah.
it there are plenty of people who spout a lot of nonsense about war without knowing what they're talking about. But there are a lot of veterans who spout a lot of nonsense about war despite the fact that they should know better. So, it's I think it's tremendously important to have a sort of robust, aggressive conversation where everybody feels empowered to be the one saying that the emperor has no clothes. Because when it comes to military policy, over the past 2 decades, there have been a lot of times where the emperor has not been wearing any clothes.
The question then becomes, and what I was thinking about was what truths there are in these war stories. You know, what do we mean when we say that only a veteran can tell the story? Well, what story are we expecting to be told there
Right.
when we limit it in this way? And
So, I one of the stories in the collection that a lot of veterans have gravitated to is called Prayer in the Furnace. And it's about a
yes,
military chaplain, right? And the funny thing about that is that the book that I was relying on most as I was writing that story and trying to think my way through was a book called Diary of a Country Priest by Georges Bernanos, or I don't know how to pronounce his French name, but it's a beautiful book. And that is a book about a country priest,
mhm,
right? But all of the kind of conflicts that are in my story are in that novel, right? Because people in just a normal country town experience isolation and cruelty and rage and forgiveness and desire for redemption, feeling of unworthiness of redemption and bitterness and loss, um, and the whole range of emotions. It's not like there's some newly minted human emotion that you get when you put on a uniform and experience loss, right? It's all there, just in a novel that has barely anything to do with war whatsoever, right? There's one very interesting scene with a French veteran of the French Foreign Legion in that novel. Uh, but um, but that was the novel that I was thinking about as I wrote that story.
there's a lot of contention around the so-called military civilian divide.
Yeah,
And there's a rift of understanding that is imagined or real. Yet you have these artists like Toni Morrison who writes Home, and this odyssey of Frank Money returning into segregated America, walking home to save his sister. And Morrison gets something very profound. She brings something very powerful forward. Do you give credit to this military civilian divide? You've almost answered this question for me already. And do you believe your writing can help cross that divide, inform American citizens in important ways about war experience?
yeah. I hope so. I hope so. And I think that divide. I mean, I think sometimes we like to stoke it, right? Sometimes it becomes politically useful. In the military, it's such a small percentage who serve. Most people think of the military in sort of abstract ways because they don't have a lot of experience with them. And it's one of the few institutions in American life that have just overwhelming approval from the American public, right? Um, and so, there's there's a reason that every presidential campaign, they like to trot out their, endorsements from generals, right? Um, uh, and that I think can be quite troubling. The citizenry, you know, is where our emphasis should lie, I think. And sometimes you'll get this sense in some military units that like they're better than civilians. You saw this from the president's former chief of staff, saying that we sometimes pity civilians, right? When he was defending the president's comments uh, to the family of a fallen service member. And I wholeheartedly reject that kind of mentality. I think it's ugly, and I think it doesn't have any place in American democracy. And I think it goes against the sort of principles that we've tried to establish from the founding.
And it seems to be stopping the civilian commentary on an area that where civilians have traditionally in America had a say.
Yeah,
And if it's said that, so pushing you on this military civilian divide, you teach writing now.
I do.
And so you're a military person within the academy.
Yep.
And I teach war stories. I'm trying to be an academic person thinking about the military. So both of us are trying to break down this divide. But the question is, can the humanities do it? Is this actually where it can happen?
If it can't happen in the humanities, where is it going to happen? I mean, there's, I sort of the civil military divide is a sort of political issue and often sort of stoked by our politics. The humanities are about our humanness, right? Um, those things that we share, our commonalities. The fact that we can read the Iliad and say that is me in that. That is how I felt, right, in the Odyssey, when only my dog recognized me when I came home. That is why I can read things from
Yeah.
all different cultures. I always think of Francois Mauriac's Nobel Prize address, where he talks about how he never thought anybody would care about these little stories of his corner of France that he had grown up in, and how we always believe in our own uniqueness and forget that the novels that we loved as a child that described ourselves to ourselves were from radically different times and places, right? Um, and that is what the humanities can do, and I think it's only more important in the current age, which I think is increasingly sort of technological, instrumental, where we're constantly encouraged to um, categorize and view people through the sort of thinnest of layers, right? um, to have a area of study and a discipline of the mind, of the way that you approach the world, which insists on the complexity and humanity of us, right? That forces us to see and dwell with that richness of human experience, but also its ability to be communicated across generations and across centuries and millennia.
Yeah, thank you for that. And and what I would say is, there's this great line. Morrison knows this, in Home, where she's describing something. The narrator is describing something, and Frank Money says, "How would you know? You weren't there." And of course, the point is that in some level, she knows far more deeply,
Yeah,
these deeper truths. She may not know the MOS, but and you play with that in redeployment because um, technically, I mean, I don't think you had that many military jobs. You
no,
showed yourself, and how did you just going back to your novel now, back to the short stories? How did you study up? Did you make little cards
sure,
so that you would know, when I'm a psyops?
yeah.
This
I
is
I mean, I read books, I interviewed people, um, I read a lot of journalism, and then I made stuff up. And also I read things that kind of got to those human truths, right? Which might not necessarily have been um, you know, factual things, right? So reading Yaroslav Hasek's The Good Soldier Schweck, for example, this World War One novel written by an anarchist, um, it prepared me for writing Money as a Weapon System, right, which was about the United States reconstruction efforts in Iraq, and the sometimes comic and absurd and tragic aspects of that. So yeah, just did a lot of work, did a lot of reading, did some interviewing of actual people who had relevant experience, and uh, and then just thought a lot and wrote a lot. And sometimes I would have somebody who knew something read a piece that I'd read. Actually, just to talk about that story, Money's Weapon System. I sent it to a foreign service officer to give me a read and see if anything jarred. And she was like, "Oh, this actually is pretty good." But there's one thing that she pointed out, which was at one point the character described as going to war, and she said, "No, no, no, you guys go to war. We don't do that, right? We're the State Department." So even though he's going to Iraq, he's like, and then yes, that's like a change of one line, but it's also a slight sort of clue into a particular mentality. So there's sort of subtle things that you want to fiddle with as you're going along, and thinking about, like, you know, what is the environment that this character comes from? What environment shapes this character, and how do they, as a sort of unique individual, respond to that? So yeah, takes work, but that's the job.
We think a lot about words, and Remarque in The Road Back, not All Quiet, but The Road Back, talks about the lack of words and talks
Hmm.
about silence.
Yeah.
And Tim O'Brien says you send somebody to war and he comes back talking dirty. It's just all the time. And so the question I want to ask, though, is, you're a wordsmith. You're very good at it. You win these awards. But are there places where there are no words? Are there things that when you're describing these human experiences of war, you're describing it, whether in short story or in novel, are there places where there are no words?
I think there I think the words are never finished. So, which is a little bit different. I think that there there are these experience that you have, and the struggle to put them into words is part of the experience, right? Um, that how we understand ourselves is in part through words, through communication with other human beings. And so, um, it's but it's not a static thing, right? So, Hegel, truth is not a coin, stamped coin you can put in your pocket, right? The 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 act of putting an experience into words shapes it in your own memory in a particular way, gives it a sort of a particular cast, right? Um, there's uh, there's an old Jesuit prayer, about sort of, you're praying to Christ such that you, you can then transmute your own suffering into meaning, right? It's not that the original suffering has meaning; it's that there's a sort of response to it that can use that as sort of jumping off place for forging meaning, for responding to it in a meaningful way, and that meaning is going to shift and change over time. So it's 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 not that there are no words, um, or that there aren't the right words. So that sometimes is the case. I think it's that there are no final words, and
I like that.
any extreme experience, it demands words of us. I think, um, we because if you can't articulate anything, you're just bottled up inside yourself, right? And that's terrible. Um, but there's no definitive endpoint for those words, because to speak is to elicit a response. That's what it is. It's not for someone to speak and then everyone falls silent as they take in the great words, right? And that's part of what art is, right? I mean,
That is,
you were a classics professor, right? How many different generations of human beings have drawn on those works, and each one in their own different way. And the funny thing to me is, like, you think of a book like the Iliad, right? So I know things about the Iliad that Homer didn't know, right? Like, I know that there are anachronisms, and I know that all these different sort of things that scholarship has brought to us, and I know things about the psychology of men at war, right, from sort of medical science and all these other things. Um, does that mean that I have a better understanding of the Iliad than an ancient Greek? No, I just have a different experience of the Iliad because I come from a different sort of world of meaning, um, and yet those works continue to speak to people in every different generation in different ways, and the response that people have, the things that they say in response to those works, that's a part of the art. The whole point of the art is to elicit those responses.
and do you, yeah, I think you're right. And what you were talking about earlier, this idea of deflection, just
Mhm.
moving the subject away from the self to Hector and Achilles, or to Odysseus, or to Frank Money.
Yeah.
allows reflection, a self-reflection that is perhaps useful, but for a civilian audience, it allows me, us, the students of war stories, to think about an experience and try to understand an experience
Yeah.
that they themselves have not had. And so the humanities are opening doors, opening windows that are crucial in a society with so few who actually go to war and then have
Yeah.
to come home and talk to the rest of us, right? We all have to talk to each other if America's going to go forward. Um, and so I have perhaps um, a difficult question here. And this is, I'm struck by the maleness
Yes.
of the major successful writers of the literatures of war. And there are talented veteran authors, though as I reflected even further and spoke with a friend about this, the combat veterans tend to write memoirs if they're women. I don't know of a woman novelist.
Mhm.
Um, but military wives have written about war. Siobhan Fallon.
Siobhan Fallon's book is very good. Yeah.
Yeah. Military nurses have written
Hmm.
about their service in Iraq. Heidi Kraft. Journalists have written about being
Yeah.
embedded. Megan Stack. But they're not the blockbuster. And
Yeah.
and I want to ask you um, whether you think that this is a product of the publishing houses, or is this a product of what we have inherited as what a war story ought to be?
Yeah. I think it's complicated with the maleness, and also I think the whiteness too.
That's huge.
Is a part of it. There are good uh, uh, good books that you can find. And there's also some very good fiction in a recent anthology called The Road Ahead, which was put together by Adrian Bonenberger and Brian Kastner, which is quite a number of very good short stories by women vets, some work by vets of color. There's a good novel, very good novel, by Duane Ferrier, which is coming out called Revolutions of All Colors. So there is work, but yeah, you're right. It's certainly not the blockbusters. Um, and I think, well, I'll say a couple things. One, I think it's actually right now. I think it's difficult to publish veteran fiction in general, right? And so um, it's not writing a book about war is not the easy street towards fame and success, right? Um, and I do think um, there are issues with maybe the market. There's a very good memoir that just came out by Teresa Fazio called Fidelity, um, that was just released. So there are good books that are coming out, and uh, that people can find. As for what gets attention and what gets picked up, I don't I don't want to speak too much out of turn. But I do think that you're right that there is a sensibility that the veteran writer is sort of white male frontline soldier, right? And that if you're not doing that, that you're writing fiction that's sort of a niche, right, in some sort of corner of literature, right? And I think that's absurd, right? I mean, good writing is good writing, right? I don't, you know, uh, uh, it's not like writing that is about a specific, just what I said with uh, Francois Mauriac. Just it's not like Francois Mauriac's books are for lovers of novels about provincial France. Like no, right? And, don't read James Joyce unless you're specifically interested in Ireland, right? No, like read those novels if you're interested in the human condition more broadly. So I, the sort of urge to to classify things too neatly is something I resist in general. But I do think it is present in what people expect from a war novel, and it's not a surprise. I think that the real blockbusters, right, are tend to be memoirs by people in special operations, right?
Mhm.
So there's like a whole subgenre of Navy SEAL memoirs at this point, and I think that I don't want to lay the blame at the publishing industry, because I have seen them publish some very good things, right? And there's some very good female authors. Kayla Williams is one. I thought there's a book called Shaded Black by a woman who's in mortuary affairs. Dell, superb. There are plenty of things out there, but unfortunately, yeah, you do have to look for them.
Well, it just seems that the story itself, as it's maybe imagined,
Mhm.
is focuses on one very narrow slice of experience.
Mhm.
And what that does is it disregards the effect of war on the family. It
Yep.
disregards the effect of war on women who
Yep.
are the mothers of soldiers, who might themselves be, it might be soldiers, who are wives of these soldiers. There are the
Mhm.
children of soldiers, so that the war story, as construed, is, as you said, I mean, it
Mhm.
focuses very narrowly
Right.
on this. I don't think it's male so much.
So that's
Yeah,
that's why I think sort of a novel like Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer, right, is very interesting in that regard, in terms of how it subverts the genre.
yeah, yeah. And when you're writing, and and this is only because of my vet groups, when a veteran shares or interprets a passage, lots of times we we will ask, who's speaking. Is
Mhm.
this Phil Klay, in Iraq, or is this Phil Klay, just arrived in Iraq, or is this Phil Klay about to leave finally? um, and do you feel that as you're writing, you're accessing these different parts of yourselves, or
Mm.
is there this different understanding that you're trying to represent?
Yeah, and figuring out how close you want to be to the experience is really important to figuring out the shape of the story. So the story like Frago, um, uh, I think the opening line is LT says, "Drop the fucking house." Roger that. We go to drop the fucking house, right? So it's very close. Um, and then there's a story called Bodies. And it took me a long time to get the shape of that, and also the opening line. I went through like 20 different drafts of the opening couple pages before I figured out how to begin it. And um, uh, the line ended up being, "For a long time I was angry." And once I had written that line, I knew where the story was being told from, the distance that it was being told from, right? Uh, that, it's somebody long after their first deployment talking about the experience of coming home and being angry, right? And you sort of get a sense that he's still angry, right? And so, yeah, each story you sort of had to figure out where is this narrator in relationship to what they've been through, because that's going to tell you why they're telling it. Sometimes some of the stories are written like a guy telling you a war story at a bar, and some of them are somebody sort of much more deliberately and painfully reflecting on something and trying to make sense of it and trying to figure out whether communicating it is even possible. To our earlier conversation about communication, the story in the collection is probably most directly about that is Psychological Operations, right? Where you get sort of the same story um, is told in multiple layers in different times and for different reasons. Um, and so, and the final sort of telling of the story is another stage of that, as the person sort of excavating layers of what this experience meant to them, and whether they even want to communicate it, because one of the dangers of communicating something is is that people will judge you, right? um,
Right.
that maybe you're not 100% proud of everything that you did, and you might reject people's facile condemnations of you and sort of take pleasure in rejecting their facile condemnations of you. Um, but you're not willing to expose yourself to a sort of more complex evaluation of what you did that was right and what you did that was wrong. And so telling your story can be a fraught thing if you're being really honest. And yet I think that we, at the same time, as human beings, have this intense desire to want to be known.
And so in war stories, which you actually have a story called War Stories in the
Yeah.
collection. So
But I think the first line is I'm sick of telling more stories. Yeah.
exactly. And but it really speaks to this military civilian relationship. And Jenks is angry.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you have a story about a veteran telling a story and being in your
Yeah.
collection. And is the and maybe he's rightfully angry, though I always um even as as I be self-reflective as we're speaking, I don't want to be Sarah in that story. So, but I think that there's something very important about how do we engage respectfully that you
Hmm.
orbit around. And as a civilian reader of these stories, how much I appreciate the that it's not about me, but it can be about me. And
Hmm.
that it's not about me, but I can learn how to, or the danger zones of communication. Do you have students who come to you and say, I want to learn how to write a war story, or I'm a veteran, I want to learn how to write? And what do you say to them?
Sure.
What do you
Um, it begins with reading, right? It begins with just, uh, doing what Tom Slade did to me when I came into his office and told him I was going into the Marine Corps. And he said, "All right, well, then you need to read all the greatest minds to have ever thought about war." And he had me just read my way through stacks of books, from Celine to Tolstoy to Isaac Babel. Um, so, that's one thing. And then just the rigor that's involved in actually drilling down to the core of an experience, right? That it's not enough to have a crazy story that you can um, tell at a party, right? And if you can tell it at a party, it's probably not the true story anyway, or as true as it could be. Uh, the thing about fiction is um, it's about getting deep in that. So, if you're at a party and you meet somebody and one person's like, "Hey, I was just kidnapped by pirates," and the other person is like, "Hey, for a long time I went to bed early." uh, you probably want to talk to the pirates guy, but you probably want to read the other guy because he's Proust. So you know, uh, it's it's the discipline of it. I think is the important thing. The discipline of applying craft uh, to the things that you're trying to shape, trying to find different tools and techniques and forms through you kind of rummage the entire history of literature, looking at different ways that people have struggled for the right words to articulate things so that you can start thinking of your own ways to try and use those words to articulate what you're trying to get across. And then I think also sort of as you're writing, learning a certain there's a weird kind of like seesawing between like extreme arrogance and extreme humility, because the sort of arrogance is like everybody needs to know what I have to say, and then the humility has to be like being interested in your own mistakes, right? Being detached in some ways from the work that is utterly core to you and deeply personal to you, and being savage with it because it needs to be better, needs to be truer.
It needs to be truer. And so the truer, well, this is we're back to truth again. And the truer is about the craft, or the truer is about you could have written cookbooks, you could have written about woodworking, but you came back from war and decided to write about war. And and so on the one hand, yeah, I get the communication, the working through, but you're communicating something to us. And uh
Right, but I don't know what I'm communicating when I start to write.
yeah.
You only get that at the end, and that's the finished story.
There it is. And when you read redeployment, how many years out now? Um, Do you get the same takeaways, or this is it? This is a different Phil Klay reading at that moment, right?
It's a different Phil Klay. That's who I was at the moment, right? That's what I wanted to say at the moment. Roberta, just a question I wanted to ask you. You've been doing this work for years now, and I wondered, you know, have you felt that you've sort of changed in relationship to this work, and in terms of your sort of engagement with and thoughts um, about war, about your relationship to the classics?
That's a great question. 12 years ago, when I got this idea, because I'd read a blog post from Sergeant Roy Batty, which is a moniker, and I wrote him. I thought I could, I hate to say this, but I had these visions in my brain that I could be Florence Nightingale, and with a book in my hand instead of a bandage. And I don't have that grand illusion any longer, but maybe something more revolutionary. The longer I've interacted with veterans and learned from veterans and shared literature with veterans, the more I've realized that more Americans need to sit down with veterans. And I actually think that the book is the common ground. And when we share a book together, one veteran said to me, you do know that most of the people who read with you voted for Trump. And I said, I don't care. That's not what the project is. I have learned so much from the veterans I've read with, but I also see America otherizing veterans in ways that are detrimental for everyone. And I see veterans being thought about either as war heroes or as broken and somehow needing help. And I don't have those categories any longer. I have deep respect for the veterans I read with. I sometimes have assignments where I ask them to bring in pictures from their deployment. And I marvel at the individual I see sitting, even a current conflict vet, not that many years out, how different they look. But the conversations I've had have shown me that I can learn to appreciate other human beings and their experiences, their identity, if you will, by reading and reading with them. And so that's what I've learned in this time. And yeah,
It's beautiful.
it's the humanities. It's reminding me why it's valuable. I write books on Roman government and slavery, and I go to Munich and I do this very cerebral Latin lexicography where I analyze a Latin word from its beginnings to 500, 600 CE. And I love that work. It makes my brain very happy. But if it's a Monday night in Hanover and I'm not reading with veterans, there's something wrong with my life. So that's what I do. And it's just the best. It's really the best. And it's a shout out to every single vet who's read with me and taught me and just shared that process with me. Well, thank you very much, Phil, for the time and for this conversation. And this is very much to be continued. I hope for us, but also War Stories is looking forward to a conversation with you. And I will warn you, they are working on their questions.
I can't wait. I hope I survive, but it's going to be great. This has been really fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, can't wait to meet with your students.
Super. Thanks so much.